Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's had their coffee or green tea or whatever's going to keep them up in the post-lunch slump. We're really excited to be here today to talk about really meeting kids where they are in the classroom, at home, and anywhere else that they're learning, right? Because we know that kids don't lead segmented lives. They learn everywhere they are. And so we're going to be talking about that. And we're going to be talking about the idea of play-based assessment, or really putting children at the center of assessment, and where we have gaps in that space and where we're also maybe moving the needle a little bit already. So hoping to have a really great conversation here on stage, and then certainly with those of you in the audience after. And I have to say, this is my officially favorite panel because we actually have someone in our direct audience with us today. Thank you for bringing our target audience today. That makes me beyond happy. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to wave introductions at the beginning here. You can see who we are on there, and people are going to do introductions as we start the conversation, just so that because we got a lot of people that have a lot to say up here today. So, we're going to kick it off, and Michelle and I are going to kick it off and talking a little bit about both the importance of play in early childhood education, sort of where we are as a sector, and you from your vantage point at NACE, and also what do we mean by play-based assessment. So maybe I'll start with play-based assessment, and I'll turn it over to you, Michelle. So when we think about play-based assessment, when you think about the idea of playful learning, and I think we've all acknowledged as a field that playful learning is a really critical piece of early childhood development and learning, but we haven't necessarily said the same thing about how we're assessing what children are learning, right? So you might have play-based learning, but then you've got sort of traditional rote assessment that doesn't really put children at the center. And so I always like to think of play-based assessment on a couple of dimensions. First, it's child-driven, right? To me, the best hallmark is if a child doesn't know they're being assessed, right? If it's something that they would do no matter what, that's a great assessment. That's going to break down a lot of the biases and the barriers that you would often get in that. The second is that there's a range of play. You have really structured play that has maybe extrinsic motivations that's still intrinsically motivating, but something like games and game-based assessment. And we are seeing more and more of that kind of work, both in the formal and the informal learning spaces. Then you have sort of more structured or supported or scaffolded play. And then you have really unstructured play, which of course is sort of a lot of the hallmark of what we want to see kids, especially when they're applying what they're learning into their unstructured play. And that's where I think there's a lot of areas for innovation, and we're seeing interesting innovations in things like, natural language processing for kids, or thinking about computer vision or other ways to assess what kids are doing in ways that are really don't have the barriers that you have, or don't bring their own bias that you might have, for example, in a teacher assessment or a parent assessment. So, and then the last thing just related to this sort of extrinsic is that it's really intrinsically motivating, right? Again, a child would do this no matter what. So that's what I mean, or what we mean when we're thinking about play-based assessment. It's a really broad range of things, but we think that's also a place where there's a lot of opportunity for innovation in this space. So with that, maybe we could talk a little bit about where we are with play in early childhood.
Well, first, I just want to say I'm so happy to be here with this panel, and I'm so glad to be here on behalf of the 60,000 early childhood educators that we represent at the National Association for the Education of Young Children, working in every possible setting of childcare and early learning. That's family childcare, that's schools, that's centers, it's tribal reservations. We are so proud of the work, the complex, valuable work that's being done every day to nurture and to support the development of young minds age 0 to age 8. And in the work that we do at the organization that I have the humble privilege to lead, is to lift up what is high quality early learning. Like, what does that look like? And really what it comes down to, what we say is developmentally appropriate practice, is relationships. It is the relationship of what adults are doing to foster learning with young children through play. And so this conversation we're having about place-based assessments is is centered in what we know and how children best learn and what we as adults can do to help foster that learning through play. Because that's how they learn, that's how they can show what they know, and it's how we can continue to foster for them the joyful curiosity and wonder that we want them to experience in these early years while their brain is most rapidly developing. I mean, it's an immense opportunity of what is being done in these early years. 90% of the brain development is happening before the age of 5. And so as we think about and we talk about what assessments are needed and how those are supporting educators and families in understanding where their child is and what do they know and how can we continue to support them, I think it's really important that we keep centering that it is child-centered, that it is through play. So the assessments too need to be centered in how they show what they know, but also how they learn. And that's why I love that we're talking about assessments with the word play, because we can't, in other environments of education, we might take assessments and say, all right, we're going to take this and we're going to put it into some sort of assessment tool. The educators using this tool need to be able to assess it through how the child is best learning and what we know that's best for them. So I'm thrilled to be here and excited that we're having this conversation, and hope that it'll create some provocative questions for all of you as you think about what are some of those possibilities of how we can best support early education, because it's a challenging field, important work that's being done, but I also think lots of opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And at Sesame Workshop, which is where I am, that's that sense of putting the child at the center, that sense of wonder and play, and the idea of equity design, really designing for those hardest to reach and teach kids, has always been the center from the day that Sesame Street came on air, and even before that, all the research and education that went into it. And now in the 150 countries we're in around the world, dealing with children who are displaced, refugee children, or just, kids, right, who maybe are at home or at school and wanting to learn a little bit differently. So there's a lot of gaps right now that we're seeing in the early childhood assessment market. I'm wondering if you all could talk a little bit about some of those gaps that you see. Ellie, maybe you want to kick off?
Absolutely, thank you. Hi, I'm Ellie, or Elizabeth Mokyr Horner, but that's more of a mouthful, so just call me Ellie. And I'm here on behalf of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Early Learning Team. And I have seen some real momentum actually building around improving the level of play that is being used in assessments. Most of these products are being used either in smaller locations or are still being developed. So it's kind of a newer approach. But I think that some of the big advantages of play-based assessments are both form and function. So from a form perspective, it's developmentally appropriate for kids. They're having fun. Let's not send children the message that school is boring and burdensome and painful. But also, it gives you data that are more ecologically valid. So you might have a kid who is or is not able to demonstrate a skill in some artificial activity or game, but who is able to demonstrate that skill in a more organic and natural way. And so finding ways to allow the children to demonstrate their skills most naturally for them is going to give us both the best insight into what skills they're developing and also allow the children to enjoy education. Let's keep that happening. I've seen a few other gaps that are a little bit less related to the play-based issue in particular. For example, the largest growing population in early education are bilingual and multi-language learners. The vast majority of assessment programs only offer English. So that's one that I will name.
Yeah, and I really think a lot of what you're talking about is changing our paradigm to strengths-based learning and assessment from deficit-based, which is really where we are right now. How do you take the strengths of the child and really double down on that in exploring, how they can learn? Amena, you want to add into there?
Yeah, definitely. So my name is Amena Sengal. I'm the Deputy Director for the Measures for Early Success initiative, which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And our aim and mission is to reimagine early childhood assessments in a way that supports all early learners and educators with innovative and equitable and equitably designed assessments. And so to piggyback a little bit off of what Ellie was saying earlier, I think one thing that we find really important and maybe is a gap that we're hoping that this initiative and several other folks even here are addressing is who we are centering when we are thinking about designing these assessments, right? So In particular, I'm thinking about the children, the families, and the educators, but even more specifically, thinking about those populations that have been traditionally left out of the dialogue and the creation or co-design of these assessments. So Black, Latina, multilingual learners, and children that are experiencing poverty. So for those who might not know, traditional assessments tend to actually be based off of white middle-class children. And so the prompts, the questions, the stimuli that are used are based off of their experiences. And so you're really missing such a huge opportunity of understanding what children know, how they demonstrate what they know, their skills and their abilities, if you're basing it off of prompts that aren't meant for them, that aren't related to them, that they cannot relate to, right? And so this initiative and several others are really focused on ensuring that we are partnering entrepreneurs, innovators, and developers in co-designing with these core populations and really centering the user experience. I think the other thing that is sort of a critical gap is understanding the perspective of a teacher and sort of the educators and how they also relate to these assessment tools. So as part of this initiative, we've created something called the user-informed principles, and they are just that. They are a set of guidelines, a North Star that is based in or designed in collaboration with educators, families, administrators, and end users. And one of those goals in that is usefulness. And so when we think about usefulness from a teacher's perspective, we really want to think about how is the data that they're getting, how is the information that they're getting about knowing what a children knows and how they demonstrate their learning, how are we making sure that it's actionable, timely, and useful, and accurate? And so I think that's another sort of gap that we're really trying to address to make sure that this information, isn't going to get data back to them in 3 to 4 months, right? These are 3 and 4-year-olds. 3 to 4 months is like almost a 10th of their life. Like, that's a huge amount of time and so much learning that's happened. And if educators don't get this information accurately and timely, like they're not able to really do the work that they are there for. And so, yeah.
I mean, and just following up on that, Michelle, I mean, that's really your core constituents, right, are those educators. Any other gaps that you're seeing?
Yeah, well, and I will say that when you think about what we are trying to do here in terms of making sure that it is child-centered and that we are being thoughtful about seeing children as individuals with all of the different contexts under which they come, which for me as the parent of a child on the autism spectrum is so important as you think about like who are the universe of different children that we are seeing and making sure that assessments are doing fidelity to all of the different kinds of children who we're trying to make sure that we are supporting in their development. It all does come back to also educators who are supported, who have the training and professional development to be able to see all the different children. And frankly, we have a gap in this country in terms of how much we pay educators, especially those who are working with our youngest learners. We had a moment at the beginning of the pandemic where they were called essential workers, and we unfortunately have seen some of that fade away. So when I see a gap and a potential risk, it is how do we continue to support the people who are doing this work, seeing them as valued, investing in them, and then providing them those supports as we bring forward some of these tools and resources, just like the tools and resources that they use every day in being able to support children with support so that they too can be thoughtful and learning, because most of them have done this work because they care about wanting to continue to develop young children to be their best selves, but they need support and so compensation, but also professional development training, and how can we make their jobs easier so that they can do this work and focus on the child.
I'd love to just add something to that. That's so well said, which is that one of the goals of the Measures for Early Success work that Amena was describing is to actually work with educators to co-design the assessments to make sure they work in place, in context, so that they don't become just another unfunded mandate that educators are working on and trying to use and forced to make a part of their daily lives. It's really important that, too close. It's really important that the assessment products and play-based assessments are functional in a typical classroom environment.
So let's turn a little bit and do a little bit more of a dive into the role of maybe play in assessments and data quality and equity. All these things we've been talking about are reducing barriers for teachers. What do you see as opportunities there, or what's the role of play in those things? Jarrett and maybe then Chris, you guys can jump in.
Sure, I can jump in. Hi, my name is Jarrett Laughlin. I'm a CEO and co-founder of Sprig Learning. Our goal and mission is to make sure every child has a fair shot at success in both school and in life. We're a Canadian-based company. Our roots have started working for the last 6+ years now, working with Indigenous schools and communities across Canada, and really sort of tackling some of these challenges head on. And we're really excited to bring some of our work here through the States, and thanks to a grant through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation through the Measures of Early Success. Did I get that right? Measures, yeah. I always get that acronym wrong. Initiative, and really tackling this head on. So when we look at the validity and tying into what Alison was talking about, we really look at play-based assessments as really more authentic and being that opportunity to understand and tackle and assess the learning while it's happening. There was a speaker the other day on a panel that was talking about the hum of a classroom. And you know that there's the hum of the classroom, and I just love the way she eloquently put that. We know that that's when learning is happening. And she was really happy when she heard that hum of the classroom. And things, and she can hear that buzz and things are going on. But with a traditional assessment approach, we often interrupt that hum, and we then separate and take away, and then all of a sudden we're assessing, and we move away, and we interrupt learning, and we interrupt play in this point. So when we're looking at approaches where we bring assessment into that hum and into that opportunity, and really sort of closing the gap between assessment and learning, and making sure they're intertwined. So we can really assess and understand child's learning of concepts and skills while they're at their best, while they're demonstrating that understanding in those sort of environments. And what we've seen personally and through a lot of our work in a lot of our schools is we definitely see that validity of that data coming through when it's really identifying not just challenges that students are, but as you said, Alison, the strengths of those of every child's learner, the unique gifts that they're bringing and coming through that traditional assessments just do not surface.
And I think one of the things I've always been so impressed with Sprig and the way you folks came up and your approach to equity design, and you were talking about this, Michelle, earlier, this idea of social connections, right? That children live within this circle of care, that there's all these adults that are around them, not just teachers, who can actually give really great input into how they're learning, and especially outside of the classroom, because they're learning in so many spaces. You want to talk a little bit about that? And then certainly, Chris, that's a lot of the work that you're doing, is really thinking outside of just formal learning spaces into all of the spaces where children are learning.
Sure, I'll jump in real quick. Yeah, part of that holistic approach that we look at is connecting families into this circle as well, and identifying the opportunities for learning that exist not just in the four walls of the classroom, but in the school and in the home, and how can we bring that data in to help support the interventions, the instruction that's happening in the classroom, and how can we use, how can we then take this more valid and higher quality information and help teachers plan instruction, as you were mentioning, Amena, on a weekly basis. So the way that looks like, if they have a game-based assessment, game-based tablet in their classrooms, they have centers where they're looking, where children are engaging in specific activities, that they're rotating those centers throughout the week and rotating time on those activities. That data is coming to teachers right away in a way in which they can digest that information, and we use tools to help them take that data, large amounts of data, to help plan instruction, whether that be center-based, whole class, individual instruction, and then feed that same data to parents and families and caregivers, and have that information help support learning at home in simple, everyday ways, where that really build into natural routines. So it's really taking that sort of wraparound holistic approach to making sure we're not just measuring skills and development against particular standards that may not actually be relevant or accurate, but we're measuring progress around learning for every child at every moment within that pre-K lifetime. So, thanks.
Hi, I'm Chris Purifoy. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Learning Economy Foundation. We spend a lot of time thinking about how can we use data responsibly to do really important, exciting things. And I put an emphasis on responsibly because it's a really tough challenge, right? But what we're learning is that when you can put the learner in the center and they can own their own data and their parents can be involved in that and they can have consent and transparency as to how that data is used, it's remarkable what we can start to learn, right? What we can start to understand and measure along the way in real time, as we were saying. You know, I mean, when you're a child, to your point, you need this feedback now, and it doesn't really end there. You know, as you go on to create really great outcomes and student success, we need to be able to measure and understand what's happening when it's happening. And what we've seen and what we've learned, you know, in terms of play-based assessment, you know, when we first started this work, well, I wouldn't say first started, but when we first started to build these technologies, it was with Lego Foundation. And the idea was, how can we create a space where kids can, a child the age of 5 in Europe, you know, can use tools that can send them off into the world to play, come back and report, and their parents can be a part of that as well. And the data that we collect can start to build up into a model where we can really measure their skills. You know, what are their durable skills? What skills are being earned? Are they improving on those skills? You know, are they leveling up on those skills? And along the way, then that data becomes really powerful for everyone in the life of this learner, right? Not only for them to be able to see and kind of understand pathways towards more opportunities, but for their parents, right? To be able to actually essentially support them where they need to be supported, you know, and then for their teachers to be able to have the interventions that really matter at the time when it really matters. And so we're seeing this as a really exciting opportunity, and you know, and this work is now extending, and you know, and when we think about play, you know, when I think about play, I think about Legos, you know, I think about, you know, doing things with my hands and being out in the world, but there is a whole other side to this, which are video games, you know, and let's, you know, and I think that there's an exciting opportunity inside of video games to start to measure and understand skills, because, and this is an equity idea as well, because like everybody finds a way to play video games. It's just one of those things, you know, all over the world, and what we're doing with Roblox, for instance, is let's start to understand how we can measure the durable skills as they're happening in real time, and all of a sudden we can convert what a lot of times is looked at as like an unvaluable moment into a really valuable learning and assessment moment where essentially we can meet kids where they are, doing the things that they love, and start to actually understand the progress of their skills along the way that can then be shared with what we call learning and employment records and lifelong learning portfolios with their teachers. And that can go directly into dashboards, and we can start to personalize learning, you know? So the more data we can understand in a responsible way, I think the better we can start to assess and understand kind of the ongoing nature of this learning progress.
Yeah, and I love the focus on lifelong learning that you all have, in part because, well, I spent some time at AARP before I came to Sesame Workshop, so I was thinking at the other end of the age spectrum, we should have play-based assessment for everyone, just to be clear. Adults need it too. I mean,
Everyone
right?
wants to have
Everyone needs to play.
Everyone needs to play, so I'm
100%.
going to make that statement. But I also think it's helpful if you think about all of this in the context of life, because one of the issues we often have is in longitudinal data on how are interventions early on affecting children across their lifespan. So it seems like there might be an opportunity there also to really be thinking about data across the lifespan and learning across the lifespan in ways that right now we segment kids into these different, well, you're in pre-K and you're in this kind of system, and now you're in this kind of system, now you're in this kind, and the data doesn't follow the child.
Yeah, can I speak really quick on that? You know, I think that's precisely the issue, right? When we came in, our theory of change was if we could unlock the silos of data and actually have lifelong data that's responsible and that is owned by the learner, you know, that we could start to actually understand what's happening with this learner. Because this is the biggest problem. When a learner leaves a school or a university or a job or something, essentially they vanish. And we don't know what happened to them. We don't know, did they go on to create skills or to have success in life? And so what we do with lifelong learning portfolios and kind of consent-based data tools is it allows the learner to become kind of the surveyor of that data. They actually own it, and in doing so, they can carry it from one school to the next, from one program to the next. I'm learning online. I'm learning with Sesame. I'm learning on Sprig Learning. I'm in my school. I'm on YouTube. All of these kind of add to a larger portfolio of what they're learning. And this is a really exciting moment when we can start to add skills to that and understand the competencies that are coming out of that, which is the hard work that has to be done. But the infrastructure is really there to allow us to do it.
And this might seem obvious, but I feel like it's helpful to just state, right? Especially for these really young learners that are 3 or 4 years old, their learning, their education has been at a family or community or society level, right? And so how are we ensuring that as they are coming into the school system, we're really integrating the learnings from their families and from their communities and making sure, because they are going to be that continuous learning support through their life, like how do we make sure to continue to include them in that process and that designing of the data and the designing of the assessments and the designing of the play-based things. So.
Exactly, and I also think, we've been doing more and more work with not just necessarily the traditional formal learning systems in the young childhood, but also like the family, friend, and neighbor care, right? Which is growing, and in certain populations that typically, right, where we have equity issues, are really the majority of care that we're seeing for children. So I'm convinced, hopefully you all are too, we need to go this way. What do you all see, and this is for all of you, what do you see as both opportunities in this space, but what are some of the barriers that we need to be addressing if we're going to be moving this forward? Anyone want to jump in? Otherwise, I'll call on you.
I can jump in.
Go for it, Jarrett.
I'm a glass half full kind of person, so I'll look at the opportunities here. I think one of the things we're looking at is the opportunity to have play-based assessments really dive deeper on bigger critical thinking skills, especially for young ones, even for young ones. Traditional assessments often were really focused on content, the learning content, and can we skip count by 2s, count backwards from 10, but not so much around the learning processes or the critical thinking. When we dive deep in one of our tools around math, for those math experts in the room, we talk a lot about math processes and the math processes that span lifelong learning, actually, thinking of things like problem solving and reasoning and visualization. So how can play-based assessment provide that opportunity to dig into those deeper thinking skills, those critical skills that are happening during play? And how can we use innovative tools to help capture that learning, whereas in a traditional assessment, they often don't. So I think there's an interesting space for that and things we're really diving into quite a lot.
Yeah, and we're actually, in that, thinking more broadly than traditional areas of learning, we have 2 pilots right now. We have one in Latin America, I believe it's in Colombia, looking at play-based assessment for this idea of self and identity in young children, and because you think about how are you going to assess that, it's really hard to do that with a traditional assessment, right? You really need to see how children are interacting with others and how they're talking about themselves. And then we're also doing some work around emotional well-being or social emotional learning in, I think it's Ukraine, and looking at play-based assessment of that. So I do think if we think about the whole child and not just, math and science and reading, where we still have a lot of work to do too, then I think that also brings us to thinking more about those, these ecologically valid moments, Ellie, as you were talking about.
I'll add a opportunity and a barrier to the mix. I think that we're at a moment in technological innovation, and I'm going to be really optimistic here, where we're going to be able to break some trade-offs between, human-like creativity and responsivity and consistency and psychometric validity. And we might be in a situation where you can actually pull really meaningful insights out of interactions that children are having organically that don't necessarily need to be overly prescribed to be similar to the interactions another child is having. So that's a real opportunity. A more proximal barrier is actually the procurement process for buying assessments. That's something that we can work really hard to ensure that the tools that come from research programs have been developed with educators and with children who are Black and Latinx and experiencing poverty, and yet we can't necessarily assume that those are going to be the tools that are purchased by districts.
And I'll just jump off this, Ellie. As I think about opportunities, we know so much about how different children learn in different environments, and there's a real opportunity to make sure that we're recognizing that and having assessments not to be so focused that we are missing the fact that children show sometimes what they know in different contexts, maybe not through a simple play-based assessment, but through multiple venues, so that we're being very thoughtful about how we are assessing what that child knows, and to be thinking about equity from that lens in terms of where that child is coming from. I think there's some real opportunities there as we consider what the possibilities are. I think a risk is how do we make sure that we are intentional about recognizing the challenges of, again, how those are administered and the context of the kinds of environments that we are doing those assessments. There are many communities where there are still challenges with broadband access. There are still challenges with even children having exposure. We kind of take for granted that most people have access to tablets and computers and the like, but there are still places where those are not necessarily an automatic place of access. So have we been thoughtful about the risks in terms of how we're supporting both educators who are doing this, and I'll just bring back forward again, like investing in the people who are doing this is a real risk in terms of how those get done with fidelity. But then also, have we recognized the context under which how we're doing these assessments and the very different kinds of communities where children are growing up, and that we will be able to give them the opportunity to show what they know if they haven't had access maybe to doing things on a tablet, that we haven't assumed that that's the best way for us to do this assessment, through, we can't just assume that we're gonna create an app, put it on a tablet, and that's going to give us a complete picture of a child. I'd like to stay on the hopeful side that there's many opportunities for us to be able to do this well and do it right.
Yeah, and I'm always the optimist. But I do think that in the grand vision, my sort of positive vision of the world, we get to a place through technology and data and strengths-based assessment where, you might have 3 or 4 different ways to assess a particular skill, and you do it based on what the child is best at, right? Or how they best show that learning. And that might be different from child A to child B to child C, and that also informs then the teaching that happens, right? But that's being served up in real time. I think that's really our vision, is how do we really make sure that we're providing those different opportunities? And that's where I think, and we've seen so much incredible work here at the show and at the air show before on different ways to assess, whether it's reading using very simple devices that are not screen-based, right? Because it doesn't always have to be a screen. Or we're, again, looking at playing blocks, but we have some kind of tool there that's not just the teacher, right? Having to take time from the other 27 kids or whatever she has or he has in their classroom. Amena, what about?
Yeah, so I agree with all of these opportunities. And I think another is that, it really does feel like this is such a ripe time to, the market is ripe for tools that are going to support educators and ideally not be a burden to them, and really center on supporting them in the work that they are actually there for, which is supporting all early learners and continuing that learning environment and that love of learning. And ensuring that we're really centering the expertise and the experience and the lives of the children and the families that are in these programs. At the same time, I think the thing that we should be cautious about is that anytime you add something new into a classroom, there is an investment from a financial investment from the administration or from the district or whoever. There is a time investment for professional development and for coaching. And how do you actually implement this? What are the contexts in which you implement these tools? How do you actually use that to make a teacher's life easier? And so if these products are not going to be a value add and save time, I think that there is some, we just need to be cautious of that. And to your point, Alison, of the screen-based things, I think that that's also something that I think non-screen and screen options are both fantastic if they are used in a supportive way in the classroom that doesn't take away from the rich learning and teaching that an educator can provide, and doesn't take away from the playful life of a child in the classroom. And so I think it's one of those things where there's great opportunity, and you've just got to make sure that you're careful about how it's implemented.
Yeah, I'm stealing from you, Jarrett, this idea of really integrating the hum of the classroom, because I think we can all kind of visualize what that looks like. I am curious, and maybe this is for Michelle and Amena or whoever wants to answer. Are there policy implications for this as well? Because you're talking about really structural issues here, right? Or sort of ecosystem issues. Are there things that you think we should be addressing there?
Well, first, resources, right? So one of the things that we're talking about here, first, I would just say fund the workforce that's doing the work, right? Like, let's just fund them.
We could just stop there.
Yeah. Let's pay them what we know that they're doing, which is they are helping support the brain development of young children, right? But I do think that funding the resources to support then the professional development of the educators, to support resources to help with being able to communicate with families. Like, we're talking about educators, but we're also talking about how do we make sure that as we talk about assessments that we have also then explained to parents and families what this means and how they can then have that information to better support their child in the complete context of what we are doing. So schools who are doing this work, if we are asking of them, like, first, let's not add to their plate, but how can we make sure that there's support and resources and assistance for the educators, for the families, and for the schools who are doing this work?
I mean, yeah, I agree with all of that. I'm sorry, that was perfect. No notes.
Plus one. All right. Chris, what about your perspective on opportunities and barriers? Because you're really working very broadly, both globally, but also across different sectors.
Yeah, there's a lot, right? I would say in terms of opportunities, I think, it's almost a call to action, right? I think we desperately need more durable skill assessments. That's just, and I think we need it not just for kids, we need it for everyone. This is the future. Hate to, this is like so much of this conference has been about AI, but with the inventive AI, we're kind of coming potentially to the end of the need for expertise, which is a weird kind of scary thing, like all of a sudden durable skills are going to be much more important in the future. Creativity, critical thinking, like teamwork, leadership. Academics don't want to hear this, but it's here comes the sun, I guess. And, but I think there's an opportunity in creating these assessments where a learner can start to learn earlier what they can do, right? And I think that's another thing we try to do with lifelong learning portfolios. The idea is, for me, education happened to me. I wasn't the driver of it. I bounced around and I ended up somewhere and I didn't really know what I was good at. And there was no one when I was a kid to tell me that creativity was going to be really important for me and that critical thinking was going to be important. So for me, I think the more that we can measure those types of skills and the more that we can make sure that the learner understands the value of those skills, I think the better they're going to be at life in general. So I would say call to action to do that. I would also say a call to action, I kind of beat the drum of the data here, but I think it's really, really important that we start to understand that this data is important and that we start connecting our schools and our systems to consent-based data systems where we can start to understand what happens to them after they leave, right? Because at the end of the day, if everything is always going to be in a single vacuum, if every piece of my learning happens in a vacuum, we're never ever going to get to the place we want to be, which is, a lifelong learning journey that is actually driven by the opportunities and by the skills that I have. And so that's the future we want to create, I think.
Yeah, and I think going back to the equity, which is where we all start, where we see those equity gaps are in data very often, right? And so that, both in getting the data in ways that are equitable, but also, and particularly if you're thinking about young children, going from whatever the pre-kindergarten learning environment they're in to a more formal school, right? That's a really big gap that the data almost never follows the child, and particularly in environments where, you're dealing with some of those kids. Any other wrap up?
Yeah, well, just one thing that came to mind while you were talking about that was the previous pressure for us to treat these young learners like they're tiny little 8th graders, right? And they're not. They're little babies, right? They don't need to actually be fit yet into this dichotomy of like, this is the correct answer and this is the incorrect answer, because I think that does implicitly stifle some of the growth of that creative energy that you were talking about. It's not enough to just measure creativity and tell the kids who are creative, like, good job, you're gonna be employed one day. We also have to support the kids for whom this is a little bit more of a challenge to develop the skills that will be productive for them in the future. And on that specific note of changing the way we think about assessments, I think it really is a sea change. And innovation is a deeply disruptive act. And so we just need to be aware that we are talking about a big fundamental change in the way that we think about assessment, and that is an uphill battle.
And with that, I'm going to jump off your call to action and what you just said, Ellie, that this is our call to action. Everyone on this stage is working in this space. We are trying to pull together this sea change. So please, if you're doing work in this, if you're interested in this, please come talk to us. And with that, we'll end 45 seconds early.
Thank you very much.